Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's time for our August edition of Bites and Bits of History. I'm Tracy Manning, and I'm really excited to introduce this program. But before we get there, I'm going to give you guys some upcoming events and some other announcements. These are some pretty great announcements, too, because we are back to in-person programs. And that's going to kick off this Saturday, August 21st, with our amazing history race. Now, this In Your Car scavenger hunt is going to start at 4 o'clock right here at the Tyler History Center. You can call to register ahead of time, but you're welcome to just register at the door. And that, like I said, coming up this Saturday, August 21st at 4 o'clock here at the Tyler History Center. Now, in just a couple of weeks, we're going to have our Founders Day open house. And this annual event is one of our favorites of the year. We welcome in everyone and anyone who wants to come to visit our site. This year, we're at the Tyler History Center with a lot of great activities. We're going to have family activities. We have a local history fair where we're featuring some other local historical societies and museums to celebrate the work that they do, because we know we're not alone in celebrating our wonderful local history here in the Mahoning Valley. And one of the key highlights of our Founders Day open house is going to be a milestones walking tour, where we're going to look at the history of Harry Burt and the Good Humor ice cream legacy that he left behind, and also celebrate Mahoning County's 175th anniversary. So again, that's all coming up on September 12th. It's a Sunday afternoon from 12 to 4 p.m. here at the Tyler History Center. It's free admission, so make sure you come out. Now, our sites are also open to the public just for our general open hours. Those are from 12 to 4 p.m. from Tuesday to Sunday. And of course, that's the Tyler History Center and our sister site, the Arms Family Museum. In addition to that, we have our Archives Resource Center and our brand newly named Stewart Media Archive Center, and that is up at the Arms Family Museum campus site. So those are available for research or just to visit to see what sort of wonderful treasures we have in our collection. Now, to get ready for today's program, I do want to remind you that you can visit our YouTube page at any time to see past Bites and Bits of History programs. And there's a lot there to choose from. So even if you didn't catch a noon premiere, all of those videos are still there for you to enjoy at any time. Now, today's program is going to be a really special one. We are bringing back Roslyn Torella, who you might remember from last summer. She presented a program based on her book, Lowville, Ohio, Murders, Mayhem, and More. Now, she is a native of Lowville. Her family has lived there for well over 100 years. She's a 1984 graduate of Lowville High School and had degrees from Youngstown State University. Now, I mentioned her book that was published in 2018, and she sold well over 700 copies of that book, which she says puts her at #1 on the bestseller list in Lowville, and I think she's right about that. Now, she has a passion for genealogy and for local history, and she's a pretty avid speaker and writer locally and then throughout the region. Now, today she's going to be talking about a really interesting topic, Youngstown as a Gretna Green. So you'll have to stay tuned here to see what she thinks about that. Now, we're going to join Roslyn kind of virtually, so I'm going to throw it over to her on Zoom.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining me and the Mahoning Valley Historical Society for this presentation on Youngstown's Gretna Green. I hope you're going to enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed researching this topic. Youngstown had a great piece of history back in the 1890s to 1910, where flocks of couples came to Youngstown to get themselves married, and I'm going to be sharing some of those stories with you today. But before we go any further, I do want to give you some background, some historical information about the term Gretna Green, where it came from, a little bit about Youngstown's marriage laws. And so let's go ahead and take a look at the agenda. So we're going to talk about the original Gretna Green, and then I'm going to tell you some of the reasons why people elope. And I think it's really helpful to hear these reasons so that as you're listening to the stories I'm going to be telling you, it kind of gives you some context for them. It's like the social history of that time period. And we're going to look at some of the early Ohio and Pennsylvania marriage laws that led people to come across the border to Youngstown. And we're going to introduce you to two of the Youngstown's marrying parsons. Between these two gentlemen, they married at least 12,000 couples in a 15-year period. And then we're going to look at Youngstown as a marrying city and the cottage industries that sprung up around that whole idea of coming to Youngstown to get married. And then my favorite part of the presentation is where I'm going to share 8 stories of couples that came to Youngstown. And this is what I call how love finds a way. Well, sometimes it found a way. And then unfortunately, I do have to end my presentation with why Youngstown was no longer a Gretna Green and why you didn't really know about this history, because it ended actually in 1910. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the presentation. So we have to go back to England to get some context for our story. And we actually go back to the Prime Minister of England back in 1754, and his name was Lord Hardwicke, and there's a picture of him on the screen. He basically passed a law in 1754 that said all couples that wanted to marry in England had to be at least 21 years old, and they had to have a church wedding. Well, not everybody wanted to follow these rules. It's again, remember, you'll hear me say this a lot, love finds a way. So when you have couples that are in love and they're under 21 and they know they're not going to get any kind of parental consent, they will find a way to get themselves married. And the way they found was to go to a country that recognizes hand fasting. So you'll see a little image there of something called hand fasting. Hand fasting is basically where you don't have any impediments to your marriage, but basically you just go in front of witnesses, usually at least 2, and you declare that your intent to be married. And then basically you are, for all purposes of the law of that country, married. So that's exactly what happened. People would go from England to a country that allowed them to marry. And that country happened to be Scotland. And the first town over the English border was Gretna Green. You can look at the map here. So that red border line, that's the border between Scotland and England. As you could see, Gretna Green was one of the first towns off the main road. So what was happening is folks would come out of England by carriage, by buggy, by horseback, by whatever means possible, and they would go to Gretna Green to be married. Because in Scotland, not only did it recognize hand fasting, but you only had to be 16 years old to get married. And you only had to have 2 witnesses. So what would happen is the folks would come out of England and they would go to Gretna Green and they would find a public place that had some witnesses, and they would ask them to be their witnesses so that they could have their hand fasting ceremony and have their marriage declared legal. Today, people still go to Gretna Green to get married. And in fact, there's something called the Smitty Shop. It's actually a chapel. And you may have heard the term, if you've done any research in this area, of an anvil wedding. So the legend is that when people would go to Gretna Green, the first public place that they would often find that where there were people available would be the blacksmith shop. And they would go into the blacksmith shop and they would ask the blacksmiths to be a witness. And usually there was another person available, and that person also be the witness. And they would declare their intentions to be married in front of the blacksmith. And then he would take his hammer and he would bang it on the anvil and declare, yes, you're married. So that's where you might have heard the term anvil weddings. So today, if you go to Scotland, there's actually an old blacksmith shop that has been turned into a chapel to help make this legend real, and people still flock there today. If you were thinking that only the poor back in the 1800s went to Scotland to get married, or people of lesser class, you'd be mistaken. Everybody from, the average common couple to nobility went to Scotland to get married, to evade some of the restrictive laws in England. So it's very, very interesting, but that is where the term came from Gretna Green in Scotland. And so now it means, if you hear the term Gretna Green referred to when it talks about a hasty or a runaway marriage, just because it's a place that someone goes to that they're not from in order to get quickly married. So let's talk about why some people run away to get hitched. Why would somebody want to do this? And I think by me going through some of these explanations of why people do that will help provide some contents and get you thinking. The most common one is family disapproval. Perhaps their parents do not like their betrothed, or they don't like their boyfriend or girlfriend, and they are not going to be supportive of the marriage, so they will run away. to get married where no one can tell them not to. Maybe they don't want their family involved. Maybe they just have a feeling that their family would just make a mess of things. And it also could be finances. Maybe they can't afford a big wedding and their parents are pushing for a big wedding or a much bigger to-do than they want. And so they will quietly elope so that the deed is done and then come back and ask for forgiveness after the fact. There could also be a legal impediment in the local or home jurisdiction of the couple. Marriage laws are based on the state. So each state has its own marriage laws and they vary from state to state. So you might have a situation where there's a waiting period between marriages. And in this situation, it's an individual where one of the couples or maybe both members of the couple is divorced and they want to remarry and they want to remarry quickly, but their state or local jurisdiction requires a 30-day waiting period between marriages, and they don't want to do that. So they will go to some place where there is no required waiting period. Also, degree consanguinity. So this is the degree of shared blood. So each state has its rules as to how close you can be in terms of relation by blood or by marriage to marry. Most states do prohibit first cousin marriages, but not all. So some states, so you might go to a state where you want to be able to marry your first cousin. And also legal age requirements. Remember, I mentioned about, England being 21 and Scotland being 16. So if there's a marriage difference and you are underage in your state without parental consent, you will go over to the adjoining state or to a state that does not have that same restriction upon you. And then anti-miscegenation laws. These are particularly common in the South. This is interracial marriage. So if you live in a jurisdiction that prevents or prohibits interracial marriage, and here in the United States, that was as late as the 1960s, we had these laws on the books, you might go to a state where there would be no question about who you are marrying. And then parental consent. I mentioned this earlier. If you are underage, a certain age, you have to have parental consent to marry. And so maybe you are 16, 17 years old and you know your parents aren't going to give consent. And so you and your fiance will just run away to some state where that is not the requirement. Occupational prohibitions. These typically refer to, for women, they're no longer, these type of laws are no longer on the books. But typically, if you were a school teacher or particularly a nurse in nursing school, you could not marry. And if you married, you would lose your jobs. So I've actually seen marriage certificates, applications where the woman was a school teacher marrying during the course of the school year, and there would actually be an annotation on there, do not publish, because she did not want people to know that she married. So her and her fiance may quietly slip across the border to a jurisdiction where even if their marriage was published, that people would not necessarily know that she was a school teacher, get married, quietly slip back to their home area, maybe live separately until the end of the school year, announce their marriage at that point, and that way she's able to keep her job for the duration of the school year. Also, waiting periods. So these are also called cooling off periods. And so there might either be a shorter waiting period or no waiting period in a different jurisdiction. For example, maybe you live in a state where it requires a 5-day waiting period from the time that you apply for the license till you can pick it up. But the state across the border is either no time at all or 1 day. So you might want to choose to slip across the border so you can be quickly married and have your hasty marriage. Also, there might be a reason why you're going out of state because you want to conceal the fact that you've married. Perhaps there's just some scandal involved and you just don't want people to know that you married or the date that you've married. Perhaps there's a pregnancy and you want to keep it quiet as to the exact date that you married and then just let people assume that you've been married longer than you have. Also, and I've actually seen this, is that you might have a couple who, if you look at their records, they've been together for 40 years, they have multiple children, all of a sudden in their late 50s and their early 60s, they're getting married. They're having a civil marriage ceremony. And the reason why this might be is that maybe they're trying to hide the fact that they never were married. Perhaps, this couple got together, they started a set up household, they held themselves out to the public as being married, they lived together for many years, they had children, but they never went through a ceremonial marriage. And perhaps they live in a state that does not recognize common law marriage. So now they're getting of age where they want to file for Social Security benefits or other types of benefits, and they need to be able to prove that they had a ceremonial marriage. So they will slip across the border, have that ceremonial marriage, get that marriage certificate in hand, and be able to claim their benefits. Also, concealment of current marital status. It's not uncommon for people who are still married breaking the law by becoming bigamists by going across the state border, going to another jurisdiction and marrying a second time while they're still married to their first partner, because they feel that they can get away with it maybe easier than in their home state, or perhaps, where they're from, everybody knows who they are and knows that they're still married. This is not uncommon, because up in the United States, and particularly in some of the southern states, divorce wasn't even legal until the 1950s. So if you wanted to marry, but you could never get divorced, then you would just slip away to another place. When you and your spouse might go separate ways, live separate lives, may decide to have separate lives, and you fall in love again and you want to get married. Love has a way. You just go across the border to someplace where no one asks you those kind of questions or question you about it. And this last one, gin marriage. This is actually a term from the 1920s, but it could be appropriate any time in human history. And that is where someone has basically imbibed a little too much adult libations and has lost all their inhibitions and decide that they want to get married. So you can imagine a couple are out, they're having a good time, the liquor is flowing, all the inhibitions have run away, and the gentleman is looking at this lovely lady across from him, and she just looks so lovely, and he just says, "Why don't we get married, honey?" And she says yes, and the next thing you know, they're driving across the state where there's no waiting period, and they're applying for the license and they're getting married. Gin marriage. So let's talk quickly about Ohio and Pennsylvania marriage laws. So in Ohio, I mentioned anti-miscegenation laws. In Ohio, you can, I'm sorry, not anti-miscegenation, but consanguinity laws. You have to be no closer than second cousins. So Ohio did prohibit first cousin marriages. Not to say that people who are first cousins didn't get married here in Ohio, but they may have come here, concealed facts of their marriage when they were applying for their license, and we probably would have issued a license to them. Brides have to be at least age 16 with parental consent, and unless they are pregnant, or age 18 without consent. And grooms had to be at least 18 with parental consent, or age 21 without consent. The law changed a lot in 1899 at this point, because people were lying about some of the facts to their marriage. Ohio changed the law saying you had to swear to certain facts, such as your name, your age, and your previous marital status. But I want you to keep in mind that even if you were, swearing to a fact that you were a certain age, there was very, very hard ways to be able to prove how old you were back then. We didn't have driver's license back then. We didn't have state IDs back then. People probably didn't even have birth certificates, because statewide birth registration in the states of Ohio and Pennsylvania didn't occur until the 1910s. So you couldn't even produce a document to show how old you were. You basically just told the deputy probate judge how old you were, and he or she had to accept it, unless they had some strong inclination that you were telling them a lie. And most of the time, they just accepted it. And so that is what happened in the early 1900s. When you'll see a lot of underage people getting married here in the city of Youngstown. Other questions that had to be asked of either party, and they had to answer them truthfully: are you a habitual drunkard? Are you an epileptic? Are you insane? Are you under the influence of intoxicating liquor or drug? Remember the gin marriage. And of course, unless it's very evident, and these people were saying no, the deputy probate judge had no way to prove otherwise, but he had to accept them on their word. In the early 1900s, something changed, and keep this in mind because it's going to be important for our discussion later, is that brides had to be a resident of the county in which the license was issued, and both the bride and the groom must appear before the clerk to obtain their license. Prior to the early 1900s, just the groom had to apply for the license. The bride didn't even have to be here. But in the 1900s, that changed. Both had to be present, and the bride had to be a resident of Mahoning County. In Pennsylvania, the big difference between Ohio and Pennsylvania is that you had to be at least age 21 for both parties to marry without consent. So that's why you'll see a lot of 18-year-old brides coming over here to Ohio to marry. So now let's bring it more local, and I'm going to introduce you to the marrying parsons in our marrying city. These two gentlemen, Elder James Calvin and Elder Frederick Shively Whistler of the First Christian Church here in Youngstown, were purported to have married over 12,000 couples between them. So they were known as the marrying parsons countrywide. Their names were listed in the newspaper all over the United States with this tag associated with them. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. I'll start with Elder James Kelvin. He was born in Beaver, Pennsylvania in I think it was 1812 or 1814, and he came to Youngstown in the 1830s. He was a tailor by trade, but he was a minister, and he married himself before his death in 1903 at least 2,000 couples between 1896 and 1903, and he was the first marrying parson here in the Youngstown area. He is also credited with having actually made it a business contract. He went out and he reached out to the Youngstown Cabmen's Association, the union, and he said, hey, if you gentlemen will bring prospective couples from the courthouse to my home on 150 West Rayan Avenue, I will split my $2 fee with you. And make it worth your while. And so that is what happened. Cabin would pick up these young folks, and they would whisk them over to James Kelvin so that he would be able to marry them. His successor after he died was Elder Frederick Shiley Witzler, and he was actually a dentist by profession. He was practiced dentistry for over 50 years here in the Youngstown area, and he made no qualms about it. He was not ashamed to being considered the marrying parson, and he is said before his death to have married at least 10,000 couples here in the Youngstown city. And it was said that at his home on West Boardman Street, sometimes the street would be blocked with carriages of couples waiting their turn to go into his house to get married. And it was also reported that he was busier than some department stores. So that is Elder Frederick Shiley Witzler. And I do want to read to you something that he was quoted at, because they actually asked him about the key to his success. And he had this to say. Well, when Elder Kelvin died and I was his assistant, he bequeathed me all the business in the marrying line to me. I have fostered it carefully and has grown to immense proportions. People say that Kelvin and I are grafters, but tell them that you cannot be in the swim unless you have a graft of some kind. And they say his eyes lighted up. Look at our insurance magnates and our corporations. They are past masters in the graft business. So he was not ashamed at all of being a marrying parson. So let's talk a little bit about the industry that arose here in the city of Youngstown for marriage. So folks would come via train typically. Actually, there was one couple who arrived here on their bicycles, but that's another story. But they would come typically via train, and they would be dropped off at one of our train stations. And our cab drivers had a very keen eye. They were able to identify, for some reason, a couple that looked like they were coming here to get married. And so they would take their carriage up to them and they would say, hey, are you here to get married? And if the couple said yes, they would say, we know I can help you. I can do all this that needs to be done for you. I can get you to the minister. I can get you to the courthouse. I can, make sure that everything is taken care of for you. Do you want me to do that? And of course, this is a young couple. Sometimes they're the first time they've ever been out of their home. And of course, they're going to take this caveat on his offer. So they would get into the cab. The cabbie would drive them over to the courthouse, offer to wait for them while they applied for their license. And the other thing that these cabbies would do is that they would give these couples advice because, they want to make sure that they were going to get that kickback for a successful marriage by the parson. So they would give them advice about, what the age limit, the age requirements were here in Ohio, what to say or what not to say to the deputy clerk so that you would not arouse suspicion. So it was quite a business. The one thing I do want to mention about Reverend Witzler is that besides splitting his fee with these cabmen, another thing that endeared him to the cabmen is that if a cabman died destitute, that he would perform the funeral service without charge. So he was much beloved for that reason. But this is what the industry looked like. In the right-hand corner, you'll see a picture of what the courthouse looked like before the new one was built. This is where they would get their license. And up above is what a cabman looks like. It was just basically a horse-drawn buggy, a handsome cab. And so That was the whole cottage industry that we had that arose here in Youngstown. I want to tell you another story. There was actually an expose done of something called the Youngstown Matrimonial Bureau that was written about in the newspaper in 1907. So apparently someone started putting a bunch of ads in the Pittsburgh area newspapers about how to come to Youngstown and get married and how they would assist them. And this one business was located in the Federal Building. There's a picture of it. And for a $10 fee, they would marry. They would like take care of all the arrangements for you. They would make sure that once you told them when you were going to arrive, what train station that you were going to be at, they would make an arrangements for a carriage to pick you up. They would make arrangements for that carriage to take you to the courthouse. They would make arrangements to make sure that all your paperwork for the courthouse and the courthouse was ready for you was there, including your marriage certificate, your little ceremonial marriage certificate that you could then take to your pastor to marry you. Then they would make sure that you had a carriage ride from the courthouse to one of these marrying parsons, and they would do this all very discreetly. They would make sure that it wasn't in the newspaper. Now, how they managed that, I don't know, because marriage license were public knowledge. My guess is that they might have had another sort of agreement with the deputy probate judge, but I don't know for sure. And they would do this all for $10. And all you had to do was send them $5 in advance, fill out this application with some basic information, like your train information, your name, the bride's names, ages. And they would do some coaching. And they also said to you, make sure that you don't tell the trainman what you're doing. They wanted to keep it secret. They wanted to keep it discreet. And then, once the deed was done, that you could pay your other $5. So $10 sounds like a pretty good deal. However, that was actually kind of like twice the profit. Their profit, if they collected $10 from these couples, would be $5.15, which is quite a bit of money in 1907. It cost 75 cents for the marriage license, 10 cents for the marriage certificate, $2 typically for the cab ride, and $2 for the minister's fee. So as you can see, they were making some pretty good buck here. One of the things that they also did, and I wish I would have been able to find this. So in order for the cabman to be able to recognize the couple on the train platform, when you sent in your $5, they would send you back this little button that they gave instructions for the gentleman to wear on his right lapel outside on his overcoat. And this button was described as being plaid, like Scottish plaid, and also a coat of many colors, like Joseph's coat of many colors. And so I have like a little piece of ribbon there to kind of give you an idea of how colorful it was. That would be very visible to the cabmen. And like I said, I wish I could have had it. I found one of these buttons to show you. But the gentleman who was named in one of these ads was a gentleman named William James Thompson, who was actually quite a prominent real estate broker here in the Youngstown area. And his office was located in the Federal Building in room 407. And when the Vindicator went over to interview him, he said, "Oh, I don't know what they're talking about. I'm not doing this." I kind of doubt that he was telling the truth. I'm sure this was a little sideline for him, but I can't prove it, but he did deny it. So that is the Matrimonial Bureau. I don't know how long it lasted, but I can show you where it was. And it was in that building, the Federal Building, which is one of the first modern office buildings built here in the Youngstown area. So now we're going to talk about my favorite part of discussion. And this is called How Love Finds a Way. Well, sometimes. And these are stories of 8 couples who came to Youngstown in their quest to be married. So our first story goes back to 1897, and I'm calling this a rowdy bunch. Picture on the screen is the Todd House, which was a very prominent hotel, very classy hotel here in the Youngstown area at that time. And one Saturday evening, these 4 people checked in. It was 2 sisters and 2 gentlemen that were with them. And, because they were not married, propriety's sake, they checked into separate rooms. Well, around 11 o'clock, somehow the clerk found out that there was a switcheroo. And now there were a couple in each room, a man and a woman in each room. So when he found out, the Todd House was not this kind of place. So he threw them out, told them to get out. This was Saturday night. Here, they were actually a couple that part of the couple were there to get married. Her name was Daisy Weld and his name was George Jench, and they were of legal age, and they had brought Daisy's sister along and Daisy's sister's boyfriend to be witnesses. And apparently Daisy and George were maybe going to practice honeymooning before their actual marriage. But anyway, they got kicked out. They did eventually go and apply for a license on Monday morning, and George and Daisy were married, finally making Daisy a respectable woman. I like to tell you that their marriage was happily ever after, but it wasn't. They eventually did divorce, but that's one of our stories. So now let's meet couple number 2, or should I say throuple. This is a young lady named Mamie Loretta Black, and she actually, this is a great story. So she was from Braddock Heights, and her and this gentleman named Charles Blakely had been dating for some time. Mamie was young. She was only 17. And if you look here at this marriage license application, she lied. She said she was 19, but she wasn't. She was only 17. But so Mamie and Charles Blakely are hanging out together. They actually get engaged. And they're promised to one another, and they're enjoying, spending time with one another. And then suddenly this man named Charles Byer comes to town, and Charles tells them that he is an actor from New York, and he becomes really good friends, really good chums with the old Charles. So we have the old Charles, who was from Braddock, and the new Charles, who is from New York, or we'll just call New York Charles. So New York, because he and old Charles are good buddies, and old Charles is dating Mamie Loretta, he spends a lot of time with the couple at Mamie's house, and he becomes very friendly with Mamie's parents. So at some point, for some reason, he starts telling Mamie's father bad things about old Charles, and to the point where Mamie's father's like, you know what? This man is not marrying my daughter. He is not to be around my daughter anymore. And he goes and he tells Mamie Loretta, you need to stop seeing him. I don't want you to have anything to do with him. And if you keep seeing him behind my back and I find out about it, I'm going to send you to Morganza, which is the reform school. So he believes that, Mamie's she's very, very sad, very heartbroken, but he believes that they've broken things off and, and now things are much better and he's not worried about it. Well, at some point, Mamie Loretta tells her family that she's going to go spend the night over at a girlfriend's house. So they don't think anything of it. She's gone. Well, here, what she's doing is she goes to some relatives and she comes up with some story and she borrows money from them. And she's able to borrow enough money for 2 train tickets. So you're thinking, I know where you're going with this, right? Well, if you think that she bought train tickets for her and old Charles to get married, you would be mistaken. She actually bought train tickets for her and New York Charles to escape to Youngstown to get married. So her and New York Charles come to Youngstown, and Charles tells her, Mamie, give me the money and I'm going to go get the license for us. Now, this is before the bride had to be present to apply for the license, because this is 1898. So he's off, he's applying for the license, or at least Mamie thinks so. And all of a sudden, after some time, he's not coming back. And then she realizes, oh my God, he took off. He took off with my money. And he's not going to marry me. So heartbroken, and a young girl, 17-year-old girl in a city that she doesn't know, where does she go? She goes to the police. She tells them her story. They contact her parents. They make arrangements, and they get her on a train back to Braddock, Pennsylvania, right? No. She does get on the train, but she doesn't go to Braddock. She goes to Pittsburgh. And from there, with some money that she got for her trip, she telegrams her old Charles, her old beau, and tells him what a mistake that she's made, that she still loves him, and for him to meet her in Pittsburgh, and that he does. So he rushes to Pittsburgh, and then they get on the next train, and they come here, and they get married in Youngstown, Ohio. And this is their marriage license. So I would like to tell you that as of, I think the next census, 1900, they were still together, and they actually had a little girl that they named Daisy. Unfortunately, I lost track of the couple after that, but at least, love found a way, and she got the right Charles, and all was forgiven. All right, our next story I kind of titled, He'd Rather Buy a Drink. And this is a story about a gentleman named William Rager and Minnie Watkins. And this happened in 1906. Minnie was a divorcee, and William had never been married before. So William and Mary, they elope from the Pittsburgh area. They come to Youngstown. They go to the deputy probate office. They apply for their license, and it's all filled out. And here's the license in front of you. You can see it. And then the deputy judge says to William, that'll be 75 cents, sir. And he's like, what? Oh, no. He basically says he's not paying that. He doesn't want to pay it. He gets up, he walks away. He takes Minnie with him, and they just leave it there on the counter. So as you could see, the deputy probate judge marks it void. So it was marked void. But that's not the end of their story. The newspaper actually told us what happened after they left the marriage office. So I entitled this, He'd Rather Buy a Drink, because that's exactly what happened. Apparently, instead of coming up with 75 cents for the marriage license, he preferred to use it on booze. And so him and Minnie were actually picked up for public intoxication at a bar, one of our saloons in the Youngstown area that evening. And also, he had an additional charge. Apparently, when Minnie was asked her name, she didn't say Minnie Rager because she wasn't married. She said Minnie Watkins. And in his mind, because apparently he felt, well, we applied for the marriage license, we must be married. He I guess smacked her around and said, you already forgot your name. Yes. Yeah. So they never did get married. And William Rager eventually did marry someone else in the Pittsburgh area. But yes, this is a case where, they came to Youngstown, and it did not end very well. Our next story is she changed her mind. So we had, William, who changed his mind. So this is she changed her mind. And we have a couple, Charles and Ann. It was Charles Stancliffe Jr. and Ann Schmidt. And they came to Youngstown to get married. And they're filling out the marriage license application. And the deputy probate, John Rogers, judge, says that he described this as the queerest experience of his life, of his career. So basically, he's filling out the application for these gentlemen and this lady, and he asks them their names. And when Charles tells him that his middle name is Briar, Anne says, no, it's not. It's Briarwood. And all of a sudden, they start fighting. They're not even married yet, and they're already bickering and quarreling right in front of the probate office. So at this point, Judge Rogers says to Anne, are you sure this is the gentleman you want to marry? And unexpectedly, or maybe he just didn't know what to expect, Anne starts breaking down, crying and sobbing, saying, no, it's not. I actually love somebody else. I don't want to do this. My parents don't even like him. They don't even let him in the house. There's actually somebody else that I met that I love more, and I want to marry him, and my parents like him. And I mean, she's sobbing and she's going on and on and on. And she goes, I want the whole thing. I want to have a traditional wedding. I want to have the minister who married my parents marry me. I want to wear the dress that my mother wore. I want a traditional wedding. And she's just sobbing. So basically, they don't get married in Youngstown, and void is written across this marriage license application. Now, if you think the story ends this way and they go their separate ways, well, it doesn't. It doesn't. Somehow they end up back in Pittsburgh living with her family, and they, I don't know if they got married in Pittsburgh or because they were away, they just told their family they were married, but they lived as husband and wife, and they actually ended up having a child together. They did have 2 children. Unfortunately, though, their marriage did end in divorce sometime between 1916 and 1917. And very sad, their first child was a little boy. He died at age 6 in 1915. So I don't know if that was what put such a terrible strain on their marriage, but they did divorce, and they did both go on to get married to other people. So this story, this is a good one. And I call this a hazy vision in green. And this lady, her name was Catherine Carr McCoy Golick. She had been married a couple times. And she was described as Pittsburgh's most beautiful girl. and she was a divorcee. She had actually was divorced from a very wealthy millionaire theatrical manager from Pittsburgh. And she met a doctor named Dr. Clinton Kane in 1907, and they had quite the whirlwind romance. In fact, when their marriage was reported in the newspaper, it was described as Pittsburgh's most interesting elopement to Youngstown. So let me just tell you a little bit about their story. They met on a Monday at a restaurant, and apparently Dr. Kane was quite smitten with Catherine. She was described as being dressed from head to toe in emerald green and made a stunning appearance. She had the green hat, she had the green taffeta dress, she had green stockings, she had green shoes. She was decked out, and apparently she was quite stunning and beautiful. They spent that Monday together, having drinks, having dinner. He must have been really enamored by her because he was actually engaged to somebody else, and the wedding plans had already been done, and it was just a matter of the date to appear. But by 10 p.m. that night, Clinton is ringing up via telegram or some way, I think he called, he rang up the deputy probate judge in Pittsburgh and said, "Hey, would you come down to your office and open your office? Because I would like to apply for a marriage license." This is 10 o'clock in the evening, and apparently he was a little inebriated. The deputy probate judge says, no, I'm not coming out at 10 o'clock at night. See me in the morning. See me Tuesday morning. So Tuesday morning, deputy probate judge opens up his office, and there is Clinton and Catherine, Dr. Kane and Catherine, and she's still in her green gown, and they want to apply for a license. Well, because she's a divorcee, the probate judge says, "I need to see proof of your divorce. Do you have your divorce papers?" Well, she didn't have them, so he sends them away. Apparently, they spent all day Wednesday looking for her license, and also probably imbibing into alcohol, because Thursday morning, they show up back at the Wednesday morning, they show up back at the deputy probate's office, and they have in hand her divorce papers, and they want to get married. Well, they're quite inebriated, and it was also reported she was still in the same green dress. So he said, you guys, I'm not marrying, I'm not issuing a license. You're in no condition to make this decision. You need to come back if you want to do this. So they leave. And instead of going and maybe drinking some strong coffee, they might have been still going out and celebrating, because the next thing you know, that afternoon, they come back, and now they want to apply for the marriage license because they believe that they are presenting themselves well. Well, the probate judge says to them, nope. You guys are still drunk. I'm not going to issue this license. Go away. Well, what do you do when you've been turned down 3 times? Well, you go to Youngstown. So they take a train ride, and they arrive in Youngstown, and they go, I don't know if Youngstown's more lax, or by this time they were not as drunk, but they went to our probate office. They had their marriage license issued. They were then taken to one of the marrying parsons, and that was Whistler, and he married them. And he did say that because he was interviewed in the newspaper about this marriage, he did say that they were very amorous during the ceremony. And, it was an interesting, remarkable wedding for him. It was also said that before Catherine left on their way, she said to Reverend Whistler, "So you forgot something." And he looked at her, and she said, "You forgot to kiss the bride." And that's when he said, "No, dear," along these words, "that is the duty only of the husband. And I see that during the ceremony, he definitely roundly kissed you." So quite interesting. So off they go. They go back to Pittsburgh. And then a mere 3 weeks later, I have to read this to you. Another article appears in the newspaper. And in this newspaper, they actually tracked down Dr. Kane's fiance and said, "What do you think of this marriage?" And she said, "Oh, now I know why he's been away." But Dr. Kane had much to say. In fact, 3 weeks later, he was back in Youngstown investigating how he got himself married, because Mrs. Kane by this time has taken off to Philadelphia, and he was investigating things. And he is said to have declared that his only recognition of anything that took place in Youngstown is a hazy vision of a woman in green, and that he was intoxicated at the time of his wedding, and that he was kidnapped and will institute proceedings from the woman he married. Well, I guess that didn't turn out too swell. He did eventually remarry, and that seemed to be a very long union. He had several children, and I'm assuming that was happy. I have not been able to definitively track down Mrs. Kane, Catherine, but I believe she may have passed away young. But that is that story, Pittsburgh's most exciting elopement. And now this is another story, and this is what I call in too deep, and there's a reason why I'm putting in two. So the couple we have is Selden and Anna, who came to Youngstown along with Anna's younger sister, Mabel, and they wanted to get married. They were of legal age, and there was no necessary reason that would prohibit them from getting married in Pittsburgh, where they were from. But apparently they didn't want a conventional wedding, and they decided to come to Youngstown. So along with Mabel, the sister, was also Mabel's boyfriend, Charles, and they came to Youngstown. And while Selden and Anna were filling out the marriage license application, Mabel says, and Mabel's a little bit younger, she says, "Oh, what will Mama think about this?" And Anne looks at her and says, "Well, you're just as much to blame as I am." And at that point, the couple asks for some privacy. They go into another room, and while they're in the room, Charles and they're discussing it, and Mabel realizes, okay, I'm already in too deep. We've already come to Youngstown. It is what it is. Charles decides, well, you know what? Why don't I just ask Mabel to marry me? So he pops the question, and instead of it being just Selden and Anna get married, actually Charles and Mabel get married as well. And then the two couples, they go back to Pittsburgh, and this is the article that was in the newspaper, and they tell their mother, Anna and Mabel, that we've gotten married, and apparently the mother fainted. After she came to, though, it is said that she welcomed her sons and son-in-laws into the family, and all was forgiven. I can tell you that Selden and Anna's marriage lasted a long time, for decades. Unfortunately, Mabel and Charles's marriages ended in divorce. I guess perhaps maybe she should have just dealt with the blame and said no, but that's their story. All right, so let's go to our next story. And this is what I call Wedding Supper for Six, because it was based on a telegram that came out at that time. So we actually have three couples that went off to tie the knot. We have Gertrude and Henry, and Elizabeth and David, and another Mabel and Thomas. Gertrude and Elizabeth were sisters, and Mabel was their niece, or excuse me, their cousin, who Gertrude and Elizabeth's parents were raising after her parents had passed away. And so they decided to come to Youngstown, and they all got married on the same day. The two sisters were married by the same person, and Mabel and Thomas went to a different place. But when the deed was done, they sent a telegram back home before they arrived and said, "Wedding supper for six." And their mother got the telegram, and she's like, "What the heck is this?" Because it seems kind of cryptic to her. So she calls her husband at work and says, "We got this telegram saying wedding supper for six. What do you think it means?" And he said, "Well, I think somebody must have gotten married. One of the girls must have gotten married." And of course, when they arrived, he found out that all three girls had gotten married here in Youngstown. So that was just really a cute story. Sadly, though, Gertrude, the oldest one, who was already a widow, she only survived about 20 days after their wedding. She died. Her cause of death was exhaustion and insanity. I don't know exactly what happened, but it was very sad. Elizabeth and David and Mabel and Thomas went on to live a long marriage, but very sad that Gertrude's marriage did not last. And it was caused by her premature death a few weeks after her marriage. this is our last story, and I'm calling this one She Stood by Her Man. So here we have George Currier. He was 22 years old, and we have Marion Spinks, who was 16 years old. And they got married here in Youngstown in 1908. They came from Dunkirk, New York. Apparently, Marion's home life wasn't very good, and George felt that he needed to get her away from that. So off they went. And before they arrived to Youngstown, they went to many different places for George, trying to find employment. And somehow they landed in Youngstown, and he was able to find employment. So they finally got married. But when they eloped, it took a while for them to find a place to settle down. So they were married about 3 weeks. They had set up house in Youngstown. This was where they're going to be their home. They seemed to be very happy when the police came and got George and took him to jail. Actually, George had, in Dunkirk, New York, in order to finance their elopement, had stolen money from his employer, and the police got caught up with him. Somehow they found out that he was in Youngstown, and so a detective from Dunkirk notified the Youngstown police. The Youngstown police went to his home. They arrested him. They placed him in the Youngstown City Jail. While he was in jail, it said that Marion, his child bride, is how they described it. She was prostrate with grief, that they allowed her to stay outside of his cell, where she tried to comfort him, where she clung to the bars in a half fainting manner, and just sat there and was just devastated by the situation. A Youngstown Vindicator reporter interviewed the couple and to try to understand their story, like what was the deal. And Marion said that, George was a good man, and that she would stand by him till the end, that this doesn't matter, that she was standing by her man, and that the reason why he stole the money, if anybody really understood the real reason, that they would not censure them for what they did. And George stepped up to the plate. He said, yes, I did steal some money, and I am willing to go back to Dunkirk to face the charges. You don't have to do an extradition for me, but please take my wife, because I'm not going to abandon her here. So what Mabel and George told the newspaper essentially was that Marion's mother was not purported what she would be, that she was some sort of evil influence, and that they did not want to have to tell Marion's father the truth about her mother. And their choices were either to tell him what was going on or to elope, and they chose to elope. I don't know what the circumstances were, but they did go back to New York. They also they ended up, I don't believe that George had very high marriage charges against him, because by 1910, they were still married. They were living with the Spinks family, and they also had a little child. Eventually, though, sadly, their marriage ended in divorce around 1916. Marion went on to marry and have more children. She did die tragically young at the age of 31. George himself seemed to have a few of legal troubles, because the last I could find of him was in 1917, where he was charged with stealing coal from his customers, because he was a coal truck driver. So you just never know. So she stood by her man for a good number of years, but she couldn't stand by him forever. And so now, how did this all end? How did this unholy practice end? So let's talk about this first gentleman, Judge Disney Rogers. In 1907, he basically started quite a stir in Youngstown and in Western Pennsylvania, and for any couple that actually got married here that wasn't from Mahoning County. He basically told a women's group that these folks that were getting married here in Mahoning County, issued license in Mahoning County, but where the bride wasn't a resident of the county, their marriages weren't valid, that they were basically putting themselves in jeopardy for having an invalid marriage. He said, sure, if they went back to their home state and their home state recognized common law marriage, they might be common law. But what happens if we have another war and the husband goes off to war and he's killed into war, and now as a widow, she has to prove that she has a valid marriage. But the only marriage that she has is a certificate from Youngstown, which she got by perjuring herself. So this was quite a sensation, and it was in newspapers across the country. Eventually, legal opinions in other states said, particularly in Pennsylvania, said, look, if they were duly married, issued a marriage license, and they went through the ceremony, we would recognize the marriage. So that kind of put an end to that. But it didn't put an end to people thinking that this was very distasteful, that these marriages, these quickie marriages, these hasty marriages, these people coming across the border and telling lies for whatever reason just weren't a good way of promoting Youngstown, that it was quite shameful. And so in 1907, a group of 20 ministers put together this proclamation. They actually had it published in the newspaper, in the Vindicator. I'm going to read it to you really quickly. And it says, whereas been charged and widely circulated in the public press that the Christian ministers of Youngstown have entered into a bargain with the hackmen as co-sharers in the disgraceful traffic in marriages by which the name of our city has obtained odious notoriety, we, the undersigned pastor, declare that so far as we are concerned, the charge is not only false, but also that we deplore and abominate the unholy practice as degrading the high calling of a Christian minister. Moreover, we further declare that to the best of our knowledge and belief, no reputable pastor in this city is party to such a degenerate bargain, and the undersigned ministers pledge ourselves to relax no effort to bring about the abolishment of a practice which has made our city a byword of contempt. And 20 ministers signed this. You know which one that didn't? Elder Whistler. He did not sign this, but of course we know why. So when did this finally end? It ended on March 1st, 1910, because another Judge George F. Robinson of the Youngstown, Portage County area, he basically said, look, Ohio has laws, and the law is that a bride must be a resident of this county in order for us to issue our marriage license. And we're not going to keep this practice of don't ask, don't tell, where we issue marriage license just because we don't ask you where the bride's living or the bride doesn't tell us where she's living. We're not going to do that anymore. And so sure enough, March 2nd, 7 couples from Western Pennsylvania showed up to get married, and they were turned around because the judge meant business. Because if anybody issued a marriage license in Mahoning County and the bride was not a resident of Mahoning County, he was going to charge the deputy probate judge. So it was enforced, and that was the end of Gretna Green here in Youngstown. Well, I hope you have enjoyed these stories as much as I've enjoyed telling them. I could probably have talked about this another couple hours because there were numerous stories. I just picked out a couple of them where I was able to find some additional information about the folks, but there's a lot of these stories, and we probably could do a part 2 if anybody was ever interested in hearing more. But thank you, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. And happy ancestry hunting. If you are a genealogist, make sure you always look through newspapers because you might find gems like this that I've uncovered about these couples. Thank you.
Thank you, Roslyn, for that wonderful presentation. I definitely learned more about Youngstown as a Gretna Green, and learning about all these weddings and elopements and marriages that happen here, something I really didn't know a lot about. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I hope you'll all join us next month for our September edition of Bites and Bits of History. It's going to be extra special because it's going to be in person, right here at the Tyler History Center on September 16th. It's a Thursday afternoon, and it starts at noon, free and open to anyone and everyone who wants to come to learn a little bit about local history. Now, the topic next month is kind of up to all of you. We're calling it Ask a Historian. We're going to have a panel of local historians led by our executive director, Bill Lawson, and we're asking the public to bring your burning local history questions. Maybe you've always wondered how a place got its name or why a business is located where it's at. So all of those questions you have, bring them in. Also, bring in those really tough ones that maybe you just want to stump a historian and kind of test our knowledge. So again, that's going to be September 16th. It's the third Thursday of September at noon right here at the Tyler History Center. We're so excited to be back in person. And I want to thank everyone for sticking with us for the last almost year and a half as we've had our Bites and Bits of History programs done virtually. We've had some wonderful presentations, some great and fabulous speakers that have been willing to come with us, do presentations via Zoom, even do a presentation from Italy like last month's program. So we're so excited to be back in person next month, but we are also very grateful for everyone who has tuned in over these last several months to explore local history with us in this virtual setting. So thank you guys, and we will see you back in person September 16th.